What is up, theology nerds? This is Tripp, and today on the podcast, you're going to get to hear from the author of Nonzero, the author of The Evolution of God, the author of Why Buddhism's Right, the author of the Nonzero Newsletter and the podcast, the inventor of bloggingheads.tv. And you know what else? You know what else? He's my favorite Substack. That's what I'm saying. I'm just saying. The Nonzero Newsletter, Bob Wright or Robert Wright, on Substack is there. He's a journalist, but he's always had a deep interest in science, religion, philosophy, questions of consciousness. He's a progressive realist when it goes to thinking about foreign policy and insists that the bipartisan consensus of the way America relates in the world is deeply problematic and not leading to the flourishing of humanity and its horizon. And then he's in the middle of writing a book on artificial intelligence. So I said, Bob, can I have you back on the podcast? And he said, yes. So here it is. So I was talking about artificial intelligence, cognitive empathy, and a whole bunch of things related to his books and how it shows up. I want to let you know, if you are not already on my Substack, processthis.substack.com, then head over there because it's a great time to get on Substack. And then while you're there, you can go ahead and get Bob's newsletter, the Nonzero Newsletter, which is wonderful. He has like regular chats with some of his buddy, Mickey, who's also political commentator and such, but, you know, a very conservative one. He also has regular ones with Paul Bloom, you know, kind of psychologist extraordinaire. And anyway, it's great podcast, newsletter, and totally be down for y'all to get on both of them. When you join up with the Process This newsletter, if you become a member, not just like a regular receiver, someone that donates $80 over the year, then you get ad-free versions of all the podcasts. You get some bonus ones as well, some hangouts and such, like with Ilya Dilio coming up at the end of the month, and then one with Kessler Bruin. There are perks for doing it, and it's just a way of saying thank you for helping make this possible for me. You know, so yeah, check it out. If you'd like to hang out in person, Theology Beer Camp is coming up October 17th and 19th in Denver, Colorado. You just got to go to theologybeer.camp to see the 30-plus theologians, 30-plus God pods, and all the zesty music and beverages that are headed your way, because there's hundreds of other people that said yes to that event, and they might want to hang out and meet you. All right? And if you want some classes, because we've done over 40 some of them here at Homebrewed, then just go to theologyclass.com. We got this brand new, spanking new, just like a month-old website where they're all there, easy to use, access, and relate to. You can go at your own pace. You could explore different ones. I'm just saying. Theologyclass.com. All right? Now, here's Tripp attempting not to look like a complete fanboy while he talks to Robert Wright, who he's read his books and his newsletter and listens to all his podcasts. Because, if you don't know this, he started bloggingheads.tv, which is before there was anything like Zoom. And they would do podcasts. They'd be on the phone and each record their video while they're talking on the phone. And then he would edit them so they were side by side and he would hear each other. Like, that's what I'm saying. There wasn't any technology for doing this. And he was doing it way back in the day. I mean, he's still doing it. But it's someone who started a podcast 16 years ago and remembers having to code each episode, HTML, into a blog post and such. He was kind of inspirational back in the day. Still is, intellectually. But I'm just saying, come on, check it out. Well, hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and returning to the podcast is Robert Wright, also known as Bob, the man behind the Nonzero Newsletter, which is my favorite Substack newsletter.
I bet you say that to all the newsletter publishers, Tripp.
No, I don't, because, I try not to lie. I can tell them they're one of my favorites. But I just switched over to Substack like a month ago, and the internet tells me I've sent you 75 people that subscribed to mine went over to Nonzero Newsletter. So now those 75 people from the 70,000 on my list are like, oh, I know why Tripp likes Bob.
God bless you. You're doing the Lord's work, Tripp.
Well, speaking of the Lord's work, since last time we talked, I did my postdoc in science and religion at the University of Edinburgh on consciousness and stuff. And I'm just going to try to avoid that conversation because we're going to talk about AI. But when you're sitting there, and I get on these Zoom calls because it was during lockdown, and you're not allowed to go to your laboratory because they were worried about COVID and doing COVID research instead of, testing integrated information theory with children in utero. You end up Zooming with lots of scientists working on consciousness studies. And I found one of the best ways of preparing is just to go listen to the interview you did with them, find out what the things they get excited about.
I went through a phase of talking to everyone who had an opinion on the mind-body problem.
Yes. But I know that you are in the business. You've switched your book project to AI. And as someone who is a clear writer and excellent at communicating things like, I don't know, the logic of evolution or things like evolutionary psych to a larger audience, I'd love for you to kind of tell the origin story of when AI became something that you saw connected to your previous work, but something you wanted to craft how to communicate it and invite kind of the larger public square into wrestling with the challenges that we're facing.
Well, it's funny. My connection to it journalistically goes back a ways. In 1983, I researched a piece on AI for something called the Wilson Quarterly, which I was working at the time. And one of the people I talked to is named Jeffrey Hinton, and now he is called by the New York Times the godfather of AI because his take on AI about what the best approach would be, which was a kind of maverick approach back when I interviewed him, these many years ago, has kind of prevailed in the large language models are an example of it. So, I've been thinking about it a long time. I've kind of intermittently kept touch with the field. But then when these large language models came out, I was kind of blown away. I mean, it's funny you said that I did change the topic of my book. I turned a 1-book contract into a 2-book contract. The book that was the original book and that I'm still planning to write and am contractually obliged to write after this one is on cognitive empathy, which isn't like emotional empathy, like feeling their pain. It's just like understanding or trying to understand people's perspective, how they view the world, and so on. And one of the things that blew me away about GPT-4 when I first started fooling around with it a little more than a year ago was a cognitive empathy experiment, kind of. So let me tell you the conversation I had with GPT-4 because this completely blew me away. I said, suppose there's a student in a class raises his hand to answer a question. Teacher calls on him. He gives the answer. The teacher says, I guess I've heard worse answers, but I can't remember when. What do you think the student is feeling? And, the AI says, well, it sounds like the teacher's being sarcastic. So I am guessing, students feeling embarrassed, blah, blah, blah. Got it right. And then I said, and how do you think the students watching this feel? And says, well, reactions may differ, I mean, it always does this kind of throat clearing preamble, like, well, you never know. I'm just an AI, but, and it gives the answer. And then I said, and suppose there's a guy in the class who is romantically attracted to the girlfriend of the student who gave the answer. How do you think that he reacts to it? And like the first word after the throat clearing, well, there are many possibilities, and then it lists 4 in order of likelihood. And the first word was Schadenfreude, taking delight in the suffering of others. And it explained, the plausibly, like, because this student may think, well, maybe he can rise relative to his romantic rival in the esteem of the woman that he's romantically attracted to. I mean, and I was pretty impressed. And I mean, the other thing is in trying to figure out how these LLMs work, I realized that there was something I'm not even sure Jeffrey Hinton understood when I interviewed him in 1983, that this is the way it would play out. But there's a particular kind of source of their cognitive power that I can get into if you're interested. But in any event, I have become convinced that AIs are going to be a huge thing. It's going to be an earthquake. They're going to affect lots of parts of life. And we should get ready for it and think about it. And I'm concerned that, as with so many other things that we should be thinking about, like as a planet, because the best way to approach them is collectively, we're not doing that.
Yeah. When you hear and you're observing kind of the public square, which is, I think, one of the perks of being a member of the Nonzero Newsletter, is the regular updates of like different, following the topics that are front of mind for Bob. But what are the news articles that are coming up? Maybe what are the blind spots? Those kind of things. And what are the questions that are drawing most of the attention in the public square? Often those are kind of like crisis questions or novelty ones. And I wonder if there's, for you, kind of a constellation of questions that you think, I really wish this is what the public square was concerned about when thinking about AI. And if we paid more attention to those, we might end up kind of cooperating and moving towards a more fruitful response.
Yeah, I just wish more people understood, that it is going to be a challenge to handle it wisely and to govern it wisely, and B, it really can't be taken care of at the national level of policy alone. It's like other things like biotech, where, in any number of labs, regardless of how the COVID pandemic started, it could be the case down the road that a genetically engineered pathogen in a number of labs could get out of control, cross borders. It's a problem for the whole world. AI has some of the same properties, its effects cross borders. And so if you want to try to get a grip on those effects, you probably should, at a minimum, be in a cooperative relationship with other nations. And we are not currently in a very cooperative relationship with all other nations, including the most likely other AI superpower, which is China. And B, you might think about actual international, governments of the technology. So it's just one of a number of reasons to lament the amount of international conflict and acrimony we have right now.
Underneath that kind of anxiety that you're raising is that picture of human beings and the way we understand ourselves in communities, the way we kind of like regulate and reflect on challenges, and the problems of organizing at the nation state. And I wonder if there's when you think of what you did in Nonzero, what you did in the book Evolution of God, and these kinds of things, is AI one among many of these, I don't know, kind of predicaments where our collective power at the nation state level is just outran by the challenges we're facing?
Yeah, it is. It has that in common, not only with, biotech, but I would say with kind of outer space. We're like we're militarizing outer space, and a war there could be catastrophic for everyone. Well, you just saw this thing, this cyber threat company, CrowdStrike, did an update that took down, computers around the globe. I mean, people died. We don't know who they were, but when your emergency services aren't working in many places for hours, somebody's going to die. And this was on a relatively small scale, but it illustrates how even this thing we never think about, like some company most people haven't heard of, sending an update out, and all of a sudden you can't dial 911. Flights are, nobody can get a flight in airports around the world. It just illustrates the degree of interdependence and kind of, in a way, the fragility of the web of interdependence. And there's just a lot of things like that. And I think AI is one. I also think AI is more than that. I mean, the more I've looked into it, the more I've become convinced that it's a major threshold in really the history of the planet. One thing I'm doing that has a kind of connection to a certain kind of Christian theology in the book is looking at AI in the context of the work of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the idea of the noosphere. He, as 100 years ago, in fact, I just went to a conference that in 23 last year that was marking the 100th anniversary of the coining of the term noosphere, Noosphere, where noosphere, however you pronounce it. the first syllable is the Greek word for mind, and he saw even back then that we were building the technology that could link human brains into a giant planetary brain. And the noosphere is kind of the planetary mind. It's interesting. I mean, he didn't know about AI. He knew, he died in 1956 or 5. And so he barely integrated computers into his thinking. He certainly didn't integrate AI. But one thing I'm doing is looking at like what the noosphere looks like once you plug AI into it, and also trying to connect the age of AI to, well, I'm looking at his teleology, his idea that the emerging planetary mind was a manifestation of divine purpose, and the moral directionality he associated with that teleology. His hope was that we were being drawn toward brotherly love, that was, as we got more interconnected, we would, our attitudes toward one another would grow more tolerant and loving, and we'd become a more cooperative whole. I wouldn't say that if he came back today, he would say mission accomplished, but that was the idea. And I do think that to some extent that something like that kind of has to happen if this whole thing is going to work out well. If AI is going to work out well, and for that matter, the rest of history, there's a limit to my expectations about how good we're likely to get. But certainly I think we have to get better at understanding one another's perspectives, being less judgmental, more tolerant, and so on.
Yeah. And when you think back to kind of that, the initial energy around evolutionary psychology, when you wrote The Moral Animal and such, what do you see as those biological limitations or inheritances that we might do a better job cultivating a culture of cooperation and such if we're more aware of them? Because I think that's one of the kinds of naivete, even by people culturally, be like, oh, trust the science, and then you kind of want to go, well, could you trust all of it? Because if you did, you'd know we have not changed our hardware as a species, and if we're just aware of the hardware, then we can see both how rather astounding the emergence of language and culture is, but also, we were not evolved for this. And so to me, I think there's a kind of wisdom the larger public square has yet to internalize about our evolutionary hardware of sorts.
Yeah, I think evolutionary psychology helps us isolate the specific challenges we face. If we want to become a more collectively collaborative species and overcome some of the more pointless international antagonisms that are standing in the way of that. You're right, we weren't designed by natural selection for this world. We were designed for a social world, which means we do have the equipment to kind of naturally cooperate under some circumstances, find people who share our interests and engage in these non-zero-sum games with them. But we also have the kind of machinery for navigating like more zero-sum relationships of competition or conflict. And the two kind of go hand in hand because typically, we're all parts of groups that are internally fairly harmonious, with some exceptions and with ups and downs. But often those groups stand in a somewhat competitive or adversarial even relationship with other groups. And both of these things draw on, our psychology is designed for those things. And that has upsides and downsides. So when you see like Blue America and Red America, like fighting it out on social media, the bonding you're seeing within each tribe is natural, but also the kind of distortion of the other tribe, the kind of systematic distortion of the other tribe that makes them seem so much morally worse than your tribe, that is also natural. And that gets in the way of, reconciliation. it could be worse. I mean, I guess, because we do have look, it is natural to have affection for people, even to love them. It is natural to trust other people. But all these things are to some extent conditional. I mean, the only natural case of unconditional love is with very close relative, according to evolutionary psychologists, like an offspring, and thereafter it gets more complicated. In fact, even there it's complicated if you want to get into details of Darwinian theory. But, there's one cognitive bias that I think is underappreciated that is natural. Probably most people listening to this have heard of, like, confirmation bias, where, we notice things that seem to support our existing worldview, and we either don't notice or dismiss things that don't support our worldview and our ideology and so on. There's a cognitive bias that I think is underappreciated called attribution error. One, it's a little complicated, but I think it's so fundamental because it really it has so much more to do with sustaining tribalism than is commonly appreciated. And by tribalism, I just mean, group conflict, which is maybe a better term for some purposes. The way it works is, if my allies do something good, I attribute that to the kind of people they are. And if they do something bad, I explain it away in situational terms, like, oh, they just didn't get their nap, they had a bad day. With enemies and adversaries, it's the opposite. If they do something good, you dismiss it as conditional. They were just trying to impress somebody, the blah, blah, blah. If they do something bad, that is the real them. And that's an example of something that makes perfect sense in terms of evolutionary psychology. And if you really pay attention to the world, you see it sustaining a lot of conflict. Because once you've got somebody in the enemy-like framework, there's no way they can get out of it. If they do something good, it doesn't reflect the real them or their real intentions. If they do something bad, it reinforces the pre-existing conception of it.
Yeah. My teenager the other day, he's 16. We talked some about this and, advocating the need for cultivating cognitive empathy before he leaves home and becomes, and at 16, we let him have social media. That was like our deal. He had to do a research project and explain at what age, if he was a parent, he'd let his kids have social media. And 3 years ago, he said 16. So then we started talking about it. And he overheard me and my friends, I hadn't seen in a while since moving back to the South, engaging in attribution error and all sorts of tribal things late at night after our frontal cortex was shut down by the imbibing of certain beverages. And he said, Dad, y'all are like, you don't have to turn Jar Jar Binks into Darth Vader. And thinking of this, Jar Jar Binks was like kind of clumsy and did things. And yeah, he made the motion to put the Emperor in charge and in the Republic, but he's not Darth Vader. And I just thought, Elgin, well done, son. Well done.
Yeah. I hope it's not too late for him to run for president. He's got my vote.
One of the things that I think is hard for us to decide, because so few of us are aware of just where the decisions are being made. At the introduction of AI, it has been running and impacting us for a while. And usually the technology becomes an engine to whatever's most powerful in a society, be it war or the desire for profit. And I wonder how you see that challenge of regulating or using a technology when it's being pioneered to work well at algorithmically mediating our relationships, to raise up that tribal energy so it holds our attention longer, so we can become a product to be monetized, so we can sit there and feel increasingly lonely, but a really cool thing we can purchase on Instagram late at night, solves our desire for a fleeting second, and this kind of thing. When you think of the long history of humans and technology, and the way the engine of the technology kind of so often overdetermines its impact, what kind of questions or what kind of like critical pushbacks to the way we're starting to think about regulating algorithmically generated kind of relations? Like, what are the ones that make you lose sleep if cognitive empathy was something our great grandkids will be joyful if we cultivate a bit more?
Well, first of all, I'd say, the technology has great potential. It could help us cultivate cognitive empathy. It could help us do a lot of good things. It could be a good therapist. It could, in principle, help us mature spiritually. It could do all of these things. It could adjudicate border disputes more impartially than humans, maybe. And I hope we'll explore all those things. What worries me is, first of all, just the sheer pace of change, because I think it's gonna affect a lot of things. Like on the job market, there are different views. Will it end human labor forever, or will it just, lead people to change jobs? And, if people change jobs, they can get over that. On the other hand, if it happens super fast and tons of people are looking for work at the same time, there's such a thing as just too much turbulence. And I think there's just tons of fronts on which there is going to be significant and fairly rapid change. And my first concern is just the sheer rate of change. Like, I think we'd be better off if it proceeded a little more slowly and we had more time to adapt. And so one frustration I have is just that nobody's talking about that. Now, I don't have very high hopes for like regulation actually designed to slow it down, to like clamp down on it. But at a minimum, I wish that when, people like Mark Zuckerberg or Sam Altman, who have these big AI enterprises, say, we're going to need a lot more power. We're going to need a lot more energy to train these clusters. And like almost nobody says, wait a second, why is it this huge priority of the species to accelerate this stuff that is already moving super fast, especially when, this is going to exacerbate the climate change problem? Because we're not, it's not like you're going to magically invent a ton of green energy sources that weren't going to be there anyway. You're just going to increase the demand for energy. It's going to be met with what we've already got. And right now, that's a lot of fossil fuels. It includes a lot of fossil fuels. And so at a minimum, I wish when people say, wait, we can't do this or we can't do that because that would stifle innovation, that would slow us down. I wish somebody would say, well, maybe that's a feature, not a bug. We can live with that. That's just not a killer argument that we have to do whatever it is you want to do. The fact that doing otherwise might slow you down a little. That's life, and it might be better. So that's kind of my first hobby horse. I guess my second one is that, whereas, as I suggested, we would better be able to handle this challenge as a species if there were less international tension. What's happening is kind of the opposite, in the sense that some of the people in AI who don't want to regulate it at all, and if anything, want more investment, point to the existing tensions as a reason that we have to accelerate. Like China, who knows what China's working on? We have to move faster. And in the course of that, they actually amp up fears of China. So they're like fostering, the fear of the other as an excuse for doing something that is bad, which is in my view, which is accelerating the rate of this, and moreover, developing it just less responsibly. I mean, the more you're in an arms race situation, whether it's company versus company, and that's certainly going on, or country versus country, the more reckless you're going to be, and the less you're going to pay attention to safeguards and alignment research and everything else. So this whole arms race environment, and of course, in some cases, it's literally an arms race. AI is going to be used on the battlefield. But even aside from that, just the arms race mentality is, I think, a bad thing. And it's just going so unexamined. I mean, you tell me, maybe you're in more enlightened circles than I am, but I'm not. And I mean, I pay attention. I have a Twitter list of AI people, and there definitely are these people concerned about safety. I'm just not hearing it in the broader discourse.
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, both of those features, and they kind of go back and forth with each other, but the speed of the development is so connected, I think, to our cultural assumption in modernity that acceleration is required even to retain whatever status one has as an individual or as a nation state or as a
Right.
company. And so when the caretakers or the decision makers in a company are thinking of their shareholders, in a nation state, its citizens and not the other citizens, or if even as a parent, right, like thinking about how you deal with this demand of modernity for acceleration, I think less of my generation's kids will have it as good as we have it. And this is the first time you have like this kind of like wide mass where middle class in America don't think their kids are going to have it. So, and it's leading to burnout. Like at the individual level, it's burnout. When you think of it in the political level, you got an increasing number of people say just burn it down. And we think of our planet, it's burn it up. And this like logic of acceleration is just like running there. And it makes sense that that is a giant challenge the moment we look at our evolutionary inheritance. And when we think of when we thrived, and I think this is something you brought up in the evolution of God, you brought it back up in why Buddhism is true, that in all the different wisdom traditions, there is a wisdom for thinking both generationally ahead and thinking about how one tames one's desires to cohere to communal flourishing. And I think that the kind of abstraction of the logic of acceleration from both the inheritance of a wisdom tradition and into an economic and a nation state engine makes it increasingly problematic, because if you opt out of that logic, you get ran over or you get left behind. And so you sit there and go, well, yeah, I'd love for my kids not to learn to play the game that I find leads to my own burnout and blah, 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 blah. Or we'd love if India and China did X, Y, and Z, we might do this. Like that logic is sitting there. And I don't think there's not a live community that seeks transformation collectively to tame it in so many of the leading nations. That's what gets me worried about it.
I wonder whether, just talking like policy and regulation and is kind of enough. I mean, if you do need something more in the way of a movement that has a spiritual component and isn't just lobbying against bad policies, although maybe they do that, but is also, arguing for and trying to embody a kind of different approach to life. I mean, as you said, I mean, status races, look, I've not managed to escape them. I don't claim I have, but they are a zero-sum game. They're not only one person can be top. And as long as you judge yourself relative to other people, it's kind of an endless treadmill, but also from the point of view of humankind as a whole, there's no win. Because it is a zero-sum game, It's funny, kind of related to what you're saying is that I've been reading a book for a podcast I'm going to do, and it's about it's kind of by a China hawk, and it's about all the things we have to do to compete with China. And I mean, it's just like everything is in the service of like competing with China, right? Our technology policy, our economic policy, our military technology policy. It's like the whole thing. And I'm just thinking, remind me what threat China poses to us? Because it seems to me that the biggest threat to America is actually internal. It's actually, intense ideological conflict, us not successfully adapting yet to some recent technological changes, and are not being able to find fulfillment in this rapidly changing landscape. If we solved all those problems, we'd be invulnerable. I mean, America is just situated, given its magnitude, its prosperity, and its physical location. There are no actual security threats to America in the conventional sense, right? Who is going to actually attack us? Unless they get the idea that we're going to attack them and they do some crazy nuclear thing, but that's an idea we shouldn't give them. But there are real threats to America's cohesion. I mean, I suppose it's true that if you can convince everybody that there's this huge external menace, that can bring a kind of cohesion, but it's pretty fragile and it's pretty dangerous because you're flirting with serious international conflict. I mean, I'd rather us find internal cohesion in another way.
I can think of a host of other options that would be quite more viable for human flourishing. When you take the kind of lens of cognitive empathy and you look at just how technologies reshaped even political discourse in America of late, if you were czar for a day, tech czar Bob, and you look at just the shift in political discourse from your time at the New Republican to now, what kind of perks has the kind of ubiquity of technology and stuff given, and what kind of changes would tech czar Bob want to
Well, it's tough. I mean, a certain amount of the technological change is just almost inherent in the direction of technology. Like the ability it gives us to form narrower and narrower groups over longer and longer distances, right? Like, before, I mean, I remember the days of broadcast TV. There wasn't even a cable TV level of narrowcasting. Like, there wasn't like a network devoted to sports or to news, and let alone what the internet does, which is allow you to, on the positive side, get together with a few people around the country who share some obscure hobby. And on the negative side, allow you to, get into an echo chamber with a bunch of people who share some wacky conspiracy theory or who share a hatred of some other group. I mean, the narrow casting itself is there's just no fighting. It just is, that's inherent in the direction of technology. Now, when you get to social media, some of these algorithms that optimize for engagement, we now understand. And this is another case where things moving really fast can be problematic because we didn't understand this until it had done a lot of damage. But when you have an algorithm that just optimizes for engagement, that can appeal to the worst of people and bring out the worst in people. And it still is. If you look at Twitter, at least, I mean, that's the social media place I spend most of my time. It's still very clear that the dynamics reinforce outrageous, crazy shit. It's like the best way to develop a big Twitter following is to start saying crazy stuff. The more generic advice I give people about social media is try to be aware of the feelings you're having on social media. If you feel like sharing something, just pause and reflect on what part of your emotional infrastructure is encouraging that, and whether it's a part you want to indulge.
Yeah, that might mean instead of just media literacy, that might be good to have emotional literacy as part of public education.
Well, that's a movement, right? Emotional intelligence, kind of. I mean, I actually don't know what all that term means, but another term is just mindfulness, being aware of the way your own feelings are subtly governing your behavior and even your thought.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier when talking about the AI project and its connection with Teilhard and such. I'd love for you to kind of tell us where that thesis is at, and people listening to this will be familiar with Teilhard in some sense, but and larger kind of process relational philosophy in general. But what kind of tell us how your previous work in thinking about evolutionary psych and the direction of evolution and culture's role in it and such set up for Teilhard's thesis becoming helpful for thinking about all this going on.
Well, I was kind of taken by him a long time ago. In fact, I mentioned him in my first book. In fact, devote a number of pages to him. In 1988, I published a book called Three Scientists and Their Gods, because I guess right after graduating from college, I became kind of taken by just kind of a cosmic view of evolution, just like stepping back and seeing the whole thing, which is what he did, for starters. That's one. In fact, he refers to taking a Martian's eye view of the planet. And he's talking about seeing the noosphere emerge and grow when he's talking about what he says, imagine a Martian that's sensitive to, it's one of Teilhard's technical terms, to sidereal radiation or something like that. He kind of means, I guess, thought. But a Martian who could kind of see the noosphere. And I think there's another Martian's eye view you might imagine, which is just like a Martian that lives for 4 billion years doing a time-lapse series of photos of the planet and watching the whole history of life, biosphere develops, more complex life forms. Finally, humans start building technology, and it kind of leads to this giant global brain, and they are increasingly intertwined, and it looks increasingly like a planetary superorganism, which was the way Teilhard saw it. So, if you sped it up, if you viewed it in time lapse, it would seem kind of like the growth of a flower or something, right? It would just seem like this inexorable thing. And the first life had been this seed, and now we were seeing the maturation of the planetary organism. That, I don't think that's a crazy way to see it. That's the way Teilhard saw it. And somehow I got that picture early on, and I think I was talking about it, and somebody suggested I look at Teilhard's work. He got it very early. Now, he was not a strict Darwinian. He believed that evolution was being propelled not just by natural selection, but by something like Bergson's elan vital, a vital force. But you don't need that part of Teilhard to argue. I mean, you can be a strict Darwinian and even a scientific materialist and still argue that the forces behind this unfolding of the planetary superorganism, if you want to think of it that way, were very strong. That it's not crazy to think of the first life as the seeds of this thing, because the dynamics of natural selection alone made it likely that you'd wind up with an intelligent species, smart enough to launch technological evolution, and then the dynamics of that evolution would naturally weave the members of this species into larger and larger networks. So, he was ahead of his time.
In kind of taking that framework and wrestling with the way the public square is thinking about AI now, like what are some of the ideas that you got more energized about, or kind of the vision that's more animating to you when taking that kind of like step back cosmic picture, cosmic story that's been energizing, for years?
I mean, what I just laid out has long animated my thinking. And I mean, to put a finer point on it, the idea that technology, one way to put how it changes the relationship among us is that it makes relations among nations more non-zero sum. That's just a more formal way of what I said earlier about our, people around the world facing common threats. It's in their interest to do something about, and them having opportunities for fruitful collaboration and so on. So seeing that as like a direction in technological evolution, as technological evolution, making it more in our interest to collaborate and cooperate with people far, far away and overcome kind of tribal divisions and so on. That's been a big part of my worldview. And now with AI, I mean, first of all, I think AI adds to that logic. It's yet another technology that we should try to govern collectively and collaboratively. And a lot of people in AI feel that way. I mean, a lot of them say this should be, to some extent, regulated internationally. But one of the surprises about AI, certainly relative to the way I was thinking about it in 1983, is that each one of these large language models is, in a sense, a miniature noosphere, okay? Because they are trained on, kind of collective human knowledge. They go out and they comb the internet, and they collect bodies of knowledge that have been arrived at through, first of all, intergenerational collaboration, in a sense. These bodies of knowledge have been accumulating. We all like stand on the shoulders of giants, and through recent collaboration among large numbers of people and ongoing collaboration. So like, you know, each AI is in a sense a miniature version of like a pretty big chunk of the noosphere. It's like collective human knowledge and wisdom kind of in it, and that's something I hadn't anticipated, and it also drives home the power of the technology. I mean, people, they talk about super intelligence and, will we reach so-called artificial general intelligence? And then right after that, will there be this takeoff towards super intelligence? Well, I mean, even leave that aside. If you just, when you think about it, as these models just get a little better, and they get better at actually doing things, not just talking to you, um, and you can replicate them, right? So that like everyone can effect have one. Well, that could be pretty powerfully transformative in its own right. When you look at all the different things they will plausibly be able to do in a few years. In other words, even if each one is not a whole lot smarter than they are now, uh, the fact that they're going to get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and easier to replicate and easier to kind of plug into our everyday apprehension of the world, it's going to be big.
In Evolutionary of God, you drew a number of contrasts that what a lot of people call the axial period and the way it shifted religion, and you talk about there just giving an evolutionary account of religion. What emerges first as an illusion starts to have more traction with the world through the traditions as they evolved. And it seems to me that there's, in the pre-axial period, they emerge in a tribal context. They're very communally oriented, ritualistically bounded, and involve a mythical kind of thinking. And it shifts into one where the value of the person is there, not just beyond the tribe. They're like the notion of freedom and freedom to do the good you bring to the fore as something that's there. You end up with these kind of like big God energy, where transcendence in some way orients you towards material life in different ways and such. And I wonder if you see that kind of shift over time between our inherited biological structure and the kind of the logos or culture that develops over time. If we're seeing kind of a breakdown of that past fruitful eruption to something like a second axial age, where things like relatedness or ecological framings and a more global horizon, and one where complexity and relatedness are more at its heart, or like, do you see that we're at a time in a need for a kind of evolution, transformation of consciousness of sorts?
I think we're definitely in need of one. I mean, I think, and I've thought for some years that, if we're going to keep the planet from spiraling downward, people pretty broadly are going to have to get better at appreciating the points of view of other people and other cultures and other situations. And I think of that as a spiritual thing because, first of all, what it can lead to, but also what a subtle challenge it is, because the impediments to that, as simple as it sounds, to understand the perspective of someone else, the impediments to it are so subtly and deeply ingrained in our brains. Again, in ways we pretty well understand now in terms of what the operative cognitive biases are, but they're very subtle. It's very challenging. And yeah, I think, I mean, look, the spiritual traditions have the resources to draw on, right? I mean, as you know, I've written most recently about Buddhism. I think there's a lot to be said for that approach. And it's in a sense, not like you have to reinvent the wheel, but I do think it needs to be put in a new context, I guess, in a way that, appeals to a lot of people and in a way that helps them live their lives. I mean, it's a really good question. Like, what is what is emerging out there in the way of movements that could be called spiritual that are up to the challenge? First of all, seeming credible, not like wildly at odds with both common sense notions of the way the world works and with scientific findings and so on, but also just well suited to the task. You probably know more about that than I do. I don't know, but so I await your guidance, Tripp.
Did you see the Pope's kind of piece on AI?
I did not. What did he say?
Well, one of the things that was fascinating, mostly because the last two encyclicals around the economy and the environment, was the first time you had a Pope kind of have an inclusive view of the moral community beyond even like ecumenical openness to other Christians, but to kind of just humanity's vocation as stewards and our obligation to the least of these and our non-human neighbors as well. And two of the features that he raised I found really insightful. One was how the kind of increasing tribal identities, increasing framing of the question of AI in tribal ones, be it economic or military or nation state ones, that we haven't cultivated a logic of the common good for those contexts in a deep way. But internally, like within your community or within your nation state, even ideas that you don't approve of use the common good. Like, and this is one of the things I really enjoyed about you and Mickey regularly talking is y'all are friends, respect each other, and have different opinions and such. But even if we were going, oh, well, what would really help those in material need would be a tax cut for the billionaires. That would do it. And they're at least going to give a logic, right, where the common good is the assumption that's being used. And one of the things he raised is how our culture is now at the point where you're so tribal that the common good's not the shared political logic. Now our political means or our economic means don't even feign, this common good suggestion. And the other thing, and so the other thing is the kind of the way our increasing technological thing, the which you called the first possible AI catastrophe around once you start to upset the civil order and the economic order so fast, things go crazy. He's like, that's sitting there and give a rise of people asking questions of meaning and loneliness and these kinds of things that in times of intense change, the need for physical communities, people grows. And he phrased it, which I guess, only if you read religious documents regularly, it might have stuck out this way. But he reads as a recognition for needing communities of difference and local areas as kind of the training areas for a global community where you relate across difference. And because technology is so isolating and individualizing, and because more and more of our time gets seized into areas of competition or economic gain and these kinds of things, we are no longer learning to be good neighbors. And so I heard it as kind of a call for kind of having communities of cognitive empathy. Obviously one of them for him would be the Roman Catholic Church, but that our technology is alienating us from the very interactions across difference who geographically you recognize as neighbor, that our moral imaginations aren't being formed in that way. If you just go back 500 years, everyone in your neighborhood did a prayer of confession in the West every Sunday, and they just happened to be the people that lived in your neighborhood. And now there's this sense where as we get ideologically narrowed, technologically, we also get kind of alienated or ungrounded from our material neighbors. And even the context for talking about transcendence, the other, the good, these kinds of things are alienated from just the real complexities of engaging your neighbor.
I mean, I noticed, just taking walks, it's more and more assumed that if you pass someone on the sidewalk, they've got earbuds in. So there's no point in even saying hello, right? And I'm one of them. I'm as guilty as anybody else. I'm listening to some podcast or something, And, one of the great losses for me of modern life is like giving people directions. Do you remember when people would, before Google Maps, when people would stop, a car would pull over and you'd think, back in those days when a car pulled over, you'd think, oh, they want to talk to me. Now you think, oh, they're stopping to look at Google Maps, right? And it just never happens anymore that anybody asks me for directions. And that used to be one of the most gratifying experiences for me. I mean, and like the more different from me they were, the better. Like whatever, ethnically, socioeconomically, I just felt if I had given guidance to somebody, it just felt good. It feels good. But also the more different they were, the better. That's a real loss. Now, look, in principle, you can give help to people online, and you can get the gratification of valuable social impulses online and so on. But again, it takes there's a period of adaptation where we try to figure out how to navigate the new virtual world. But that's where it's going to be happening. There's just no that's where a lot of it is inevitably going to be happening. I mean, I think it's great. I value the neighbors I still know well enough to stop and talk to, but there just is less physical interaction than there used to be.
When you think of um, the kind of conversation that you've had with a number of different scientists around purpose, direction, these kinds of things in relationship to evolution, that's one of those words are very triggering for
Mhm. Mhm.
in a scientific community, and yet those are also for humans tended to be the framings in which we had collaborative cooperation to do big things, right? That we kind of would tell a story that we're in where collectively we have a shared investment of where we're going. And I know that in the like since you kind of first raised it maybe 15 years ago or so, I remember it coming up some and blogging head stuff to today. The younger the philosopher of science is or someone working in the biological science, the more likely they are to use those kinds of words, especially at the kind of expanded biological synthesis once the kind of like neo-Darwinian hookup of DNA and natural selection started to get widened. That's been the case. How do you see that transformation changing the way we even imagine our tasks at telling stories or thinking about cooperation in a world that for so long has been big story phobic, whether for postmodern reasons or for scientific reasons, or sometimes people are just allergic to big stories because they know some of the other ones have been so death dealing to people. But there seems
Yeah.
to be a real genuine interest. Like even in Edinburgh, I had graduate students who aren't religiously oriented, but are doing a master's in science and religion because they're scientists and they're interested in questions around purpose, direction, or meaning and such.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I mean, as for the average kind of Darwinian biologist, a lot of them would be comfortable talking about purpose only in the local sense that an organism has a purpose imbued by natural selection. So, yes, organisms have goals. The ultimate goal for an organism is to get genes into the next generation, whether they think about that or not. That is what their 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 other goals are subordinate to, and so on. I mean, that's a fairly uncontroversial sense in which biologists would talk about purpose. When you start talking about the possibility that the whole evolutionary system has a purpose, a whole lot of them would get off the bus. I think that's still not super popular among evolutionary biologists. I think one reason it's dismissed so immediately by some is because of this confusion between the question of purpose and the question of whether of kind of a fundamentally Darwinian point of view. In other words, I don't know that many people appreciate that you can have a strictly Darwinian account of evolution. It's just basically natural selection along with some frills that I mean that or theoretical refinements of the theory of natural selection or extensions or whatever. But in any event, basically nuts and bolts mechanistic view of evolution. And still, you could argue that, well, if you step back and look at the kind of direction it seems to have, it is still possible that in some sense or another, a larger purpose is unfolding. And it could be, there are a lot of versions of this. There's a flat out religious version, like maybe it's a divine purpose unfolding. There's like the simulation version where, well, we're in a simulation and this unfolding, let's just, it's like whoever started the simulation, maybe they're betting on whether we're going to blow up the world and it's just like a video game. Who knows? Even that would be a purpose. There would be a purpose in the system, or one of my faves is this meta-natural selection thing where universes actually give birth to other universes, and the ones that are best at reproducing are the ones whose properties become common in universes, and intelligent life is conducive to this reproducing, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, through that, that's a case where you could come up with an analog of natural selection on a vast scale that in this view, the unfolding of life would have a purpose. Anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying that there's a lot of different ways that evolution could have a purpose, and it could have a purpose even if it's just this Darwinian mechanistic system. But the other thing I'd add, by the way, you mentioned the big story and this like grand, the whole idea of a grand narrative, stepping back and viewing the whole thing in cosmic sweep, and maybe backing up all the way to the origin of the universe. There are a lot of big story advocates who actually don't like purpose. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
I haven't.
It seems a bit of a performative contradiction, right? Like just by the very nature of story. And to do so is to be giving an account of both your desire to know, your desire to tell, and to communicate your knowing through the telling of a narrative to another person, right? Like, I mean, that was one of Paul Ricoeur's big kind of critiques to that form of scientific telling, is that the telling of time, where agency is in some way determinative of the flow of it. Like we tell the story that way. No one tells it. You don't know your own story or tell another story without the kind of your own experience of the every moment. The past shows up, you're inheriting it, and there's some valuative judgment of the next moment that you're going into, and that goes all the way down, like at least to the first, single-celled organisms. They survive or thrive based on the way they relate to their environment and respond to it. But the act of telling the story is inscribing it in something different. And this is what philosophers end up thinking when they.
By the way, when I was a freshman at Texas Christian University, if I remember correctly, Paul Ricoeur actually came and spoke.
Oh yeah, I love Paul Ricoeur.
And I'm glad you understand what he was saying, because at the time I had no idea what he was talking about.
Well, it depends on what topic he gets going on. But one of the things even about big stories that he raised, he's famous for these two essays he did where the concept of the masters of suspicion, when people use that phrase, that was his term for like Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, Darwin, and evolutionary psych does this. But the sense that like once false consciousness becomes something that we give explanation for, where you're not transparent to your own thinking, then when you ask questions of meaning, you're not just challenging questions of meaning like external ones, like how do you assert truth about this in the cosmos, or this related to history, or this where you're debating external things. Now even the thinker isn't transparent to themselves, and that's something you just never get over. It's and I think that kind of suspicion, he said, was originally turned towards the narratives that claimed the West, right, towards more religious ones, or the story of democracy eventually, and these kinds of things. But he thought it should also, in some sense, demythologize any big story that you're telling, and in doing so, you recognize that to be human or to ask the question of being, or to narrate yourself is less an extractive account of everything you know, but a propositional one about how you engage the world. And that's why I find the scientific accounts of the cosmos, ones that generate kind of gratitude and awe, tell the big story, like they function in that way because they're a disposition towards the world. It's like, how do you tell the story of all we're inheriting, all the complexities from 13.8 billion years ago, all the way to the present, where somehow series of regularities give rise to new layers of emergence, get a couple dead stars, and now you got a periodic table where one side's stable and the other one's down to play, and then life emerges, and you go through this whole thing. Like, how do you look at all of that to holding our babies for the first time and going, what the hell? How did this happen? And then eye contact when you fall in love, to, forgiveness and deep betrayal, like all that stuff sits there. To me, that generates like the desire to want to tell us, like to tell that story and include all of even our own experience in it, is a dispositional act. And I think one of the challenges that so many of our inherited stories, even the ones out of the axial age, did, they didn't have the larger cosmic story that we're a part of in it. But they were very aware, be it take your book on Buddhism or think the evolution of God, of like that you're inheriting human beings who have huge potential and tendencies to suck. And so I think part of one of the challenges we're at is one where the kind of inheritance of wisdom of traditions that wrestled with the human challenge, but then now setting it in a story where the story isn't like a single sovereign march of the divine or whatever, but one where there is the ongoing kind of flux of becoming, but this generative possibility that develops from quantum fluctuation in a vacuum to enjoying Bach or chocolate liqueur.
I'm curious, do you find, I mean, on this question of whether you throw in the word purpose to the big story, and again, there are advocates of the big story and tellers of the big story who assiduously avoid the word, perhaps to keep their credentials strong in the scientific community, or maybe, I don't know, for other reasons. But in your experience, does the word matter to many people? I mean, I guess I'm thinking younger people who are spiritually inclined, maybe religiously inclined in a very theologically liberal way, but I don't know. I mean, I wonder if it's just because I'm older that I find the word the phenomenon interesting, the question interesting of whether there is in some sense a larger purpose unfolding. I mean, I was brought up in a conventionally religious way. There was a larger purpose I was living in my life in accordance with. So I guess I find that appealing. But maybe people don't. I don't care. I don't know. What are you finding?
Well, one of my dream interviews for you is with Philip Goff, the philosopher.
Oh, it's funny. I just was reading his Twitter thread last night that he has some new take on quantum physics that he's developing. Yeah, I don't know him at all, but I
happy to introduce you. But his newest book, like normal person book, is called Why: The Purpose of the Universe, and in it, he's taking the normal definition of God and talking about its connection to purpose. And so he does like all the science stuff and there is a purpose to evolution, and he does all the Bayesian stuff and things like that. And that the traditional concept of God doesn't work. So he kind of manages to piss everyone off at the same time in the book. I imagine it's like when you explained the new agnosticism to your religious and new atheist friends, that it managed to infuriate each of them for not being interesting. But
yeah, the new atheists weren't actually my friends to begin with, but no, they wouldn't have been happy about it.
Well, I don't need to get you going on that one conversation with Dan Dennett. We know that is
actually I was on better terms with him than with Sam Harris, but
I'm not surprised.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to me is at least in science and religions areas, it tends to be those that, like, if you're at least a compatibilist about consciousness, which seems about a philosophical dodge, or someone, a panpsychist, a pan-experientialist, or a dual aspect monist, or any of these other ones, then the moment there's some top-down causality or strong emergence or something like that, where whatever kind of complexity the entity has, its agency is part of what becomes the material inheritance the next moment, then purpose emerges. But see, it emerges at a micro level, which I think a lot of times those of older science and religion generation that were allergic to it, they heard the introduction of purpose as some single cosmic purpose that's external, as opposed to one that kind of builds up from the micro purpose of each entity's responding. And then you could talk about the complexity, like why I actually find one of the things about Teilhard's vision that's helpful is the recognition that like agency can happen in a collective way, which we could tell a biological story where that's the case. But then the idea that in some planetary way, or that like there's that in a collective sense of agency, it's easy to tell our past story where humans did this and this and this, but none of them individually seized it. But when historians give account of it, it's generally the old debate was like an account between like a materialist account of history and think like the Marxian side, or the idealist account like Hegel, or these big figures in history or big ideas. And I think in many ways that the kind of like the philosophy of history and the story of evolution in spaces where you're not a reductive materialist or a supernatural dualist, there's like a real energy for kind of like micro teleologies or collective ones. And when those work well, right, like they work well and we flourish precisely because we're able to collaborate or have non-zero sum relations and these kinds of things. And I think that gives a different way of reading human history, the history of life, religious histories, similar to what you do in Evolution of God and things. When it goes to individuals and such, one of my friends, Ryan Burge, he wrote the book on the nuns, like none when you check religion as your option.
N-O-N-E.
Yeah, N-O-N-E. What's fascinating is how if you just look at that group and then they answer all the religious questions, they don't end up being significantly different when it goes to belief in some ultimate reality, ecstatic religious experience, mystical encounters that transformed life. Like they still have all of those. And so I think part of what is happening kind of after the hangover of kind of reductive materialism is that there's this gap between identities, desire to identify with any historic collective, and a desire to explain or locate or ground their encounter with the transcendent, their whatever language you want to use, but like spiritual orientation in a big story. And so like questions of purpose or meaning, value, that are grounded in community with wisdom of traditions and such. I think there's a real yearning for stuff like that. And I think what's fascinating to me is some of the ugliest versions of it. I guess this is a judgment of certain people, but the attraction of, say, like Jordan Peterson or Russell Brand finding Jesus, and these kinds of things is if you have experiences where you couldn't tell your story without them, and to the normal labels you would use to locate yourself are of falsifiable or problematic collectives, like normal religious box, then a lot of you click none. But it's not because they love Bill Maher, and it's not because they don't have the experiences that they want community and to kind of wrestle with collectively. And then the ugly ones tend to be the people who use declarative sentences without the kind of humility anything of ultimacy deserve. And like that's why I'm real excited about the AI book and thinking about seeing all you do with it, because I think given that human beings are born at square one and then you internalize the culture and everything around you, I find probably the similar people we hang out with the most that are allergic to traditional religious groups, they forget that everyone's born somewhere, and you learn to orient yourself in community. And traditions orient you towards care for the other, and the least of these, ones that think understanding your finitude and limits and brokenness is the beginning of transformation. Ones that think that you are one expression of being the beloved, and that's true about your neighbor and theoretically even your enemy. That very few people are going to, at least of late, get a perspective to cultivate a big story in a way where you have a community of transformation and such. And so I think like religions do a bad job by not evolving, and I think kind of like modern Enlightenment culture has done a bad job at thinking that it can reproduce something that as a species and as cultures we spent thousands of years inheriting and fine-tuning and evolving. And so in my mind, something that would be rather beautiful is like if we cultivate enough cognitive empathy to hold all big stories in an open-handed way rather than a closed-fisted way, then there'll be something we can hand on to orient ourselves generationally towards the cosmic story that we're a part of, but also like the human story of like, how do you live in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy? Right now, I don't know what that looks like, but I think that desire for the questions of meaning, purpose, value aren't being set aside, and they take all sorts of different expressions. And when we think our big story has to have a kind of finality and certainty to it, then a lot of us resist giving them. And so like that open-handed disposition, I think is something that could find more resonance, or at least I have. But you know how the internet works. Maybe it's just all the people into it find me, Bob, and then I tell them they should go find the Nonzero Newsletter so they can cultivate cognitive empathy, and I regularly tell them like this is because I hang out with very progressive Christians. I tell them like they don't even understand the tradition's anthropology. They need to be progressive realists, otherwise,
Yeah.
they don't.
You're trying to sell them the whole package. This is impressive.
Yeah.
The whole Bob package. Yeah, every big story should come with some humility for starters, because there's so much we can't understand. I mean, and you mentioned early on that you've been, when you were doing your postdoc, you were having a lot of conversations about consciousness. To me, that's pretty central to all of this, because on the one hand, it helps give a theme to some versions of the big story I like. And by consciousness, I mean sentience, subjective experience, the fact that it's like something to be alive. And one role it can play in the story is like one thing evolution seems to do is give us over time richer and richer forms of consciousness until we finally get this species is actually self-conscious, like aware of the fact that there is this consciousness thing. And that is where some humility should come in, because we really don't understand it. I mean, there is no satisfactory scientific account of consciousness. And I think people who think that science has some kind of full explanation of it just don't understand what the problem is to begin with, don't understand what the mind-body problem is to begin with. But to me, that is one of the more heartening themes in the kind of big story I like to tell, is just that consciousness, if you imagine a world of organisms that didn't have subjective experience, couldn't feel pleasure or pain or anything else, well, I wouldn't have much moral significance, I think. But it does, for reasons we don't understand. And this source of meaning, consciousness, evolution just generates more and more of it. And this is something Teilhard emphasized. Now, of course, he saw more of a causal role in a certain sense for consciousness than some scientists would be comfortable with, but the directionality is pretty undeniable, it seems to me. I mean, evolution seems to be a machine that generates more and more complex forms of sentience, and that gives life meaning, and that's amazing. I mean, that doesn't get evolution off the hook, because natural selection has involved a huge amount of suffering, right? I mean, a lot of the sentience has gone towards suffering in the creative process, in the process of creating new forms of life. It's been a ridiculous amount of suffering, That's why it would be such a tragedy if now that we've gotten to a point where at least our species could kind of, in principle, could say, well, why don't we just talk about this thing and work things out so we don't have a bunch of wars and killing, and then finally we'd be working at a net profit instead of a net deficit in terms of suffering. Be ashamed to blow it.
I have one other question, but something that came to mind just in what you were saying. There, Teilhard is one of the process philosophers. Alfred North Whitehead, another one that I've spent a lot of time with. And one of the things he pointed out in his book, Function of Reason, and this is a lecture series he was doing on kind of philosophy of science, is that he points out how the belief that the fitness for survival is identical with the best exemplification of the art of life is one of the problematic ways a kind of metaphysical a priori commitment gets woven into the way we tell the story of life. And in the book and in a couple of the essays, he talks about how there's the task of living, just to be alive, but then there's to live well and then to live better. And the accounts of collectives or the accounts of a species or these kinds of things understand the difference between them. And part of it, he thinks, comes from an allergy to recognizing the role of experience in each entity, because he's a pan-experientialist. And he has these two essays called Nature Alive and Nature Dead. And in it, he's kind of pointing out a lot of when we give scientific accounts of the world, so often it's already collapsed out all the complexities of things, and you end up giving an account of a lifeless world that has happened, and forget that you're actually a part of it and you have your own experiential account of it. That and even the way you give the account of your own past, let alone what are we abstracting out of other things. He talks about it as the bifurcation of nature, and I think that the kind of desire for a complete empirical account of things ends up cutting out of our story of existence, the place where life becomes lively, and so often even those who give those accounts, when you get to know them, have already, in some sense, they falsify it precisely by their living. The one time when I was doing my PhD and was in the middle of the philosophy of science and biology seminar, and Dan Dennett was coming to visit, and I was tasked as the one, organizing his visiting and such. And we have this ongoing email exchange where he wants to see if there was a graduate student that might be helpful to go spend the day with him and his wife, because they wanted to go to wine country while they're there. And he has this beautiful paragraph about how much they love each other and a chance to, have this encounter and blah, blah, blah. So he's thinking about a student. He's thinking about, I don't travel if she can't come because I want to get to spend time with her. And it's this beautiful thing. So when I go pick him up and we're talking, I'm like, so exactly where does that fit in your account? That you think about other students? Is it just because you want them to believe your ideas because they went out with you? Or are you thinking about your time as a student and that the idea of someone you're riding on getting to spend the day with you is there? When you think about your wife, y'all aren't having any more kids and at your age, but there's something that is just the sheer joy of going wine tasting with my person makes showing up in this class and traveling worth it, right? And it was one of those moments where he goes, well, there's just not a full explanation of that for me, but I do enjoy the wine, and I remember being a student, and to me that's one account where I go, and he's not even the worst when it goes to getting rid of consciousness.
He's pretty bad.
But they're worse.
I don't mean bad in the sense
I
of
know.
morally bad, but in the sense of I think his account winds up eliminating consciousness more thoroughly than he ever wanted to
Correct.
acknowledge. But
And I
That's
think that's
another.
what
But it
that.
always drove him crazy when I said that, so I withdraw it in memory of him.
Yeah. Oh, I found him. I found him as a person to be significantly more compelling than I found reading him. And part of it was because if you sent me that email and thought about a student and loved wine tasting with your wife, I know something about who you are when you show up. Someone that knows I only have so many days to live and I want to go wine tasting with my favorite person. And if I got someone to drive us around, because we're probably old and can only taste so much to drive safely, if it's a graduate student who would really enjoy and get to tell that story later, and they can try their ideas out on us while we're going around. Like whoever the person is that makes judgments that way is more compelling to me than when I just read his book. And I think that's like when I think of how questions of science around purpose or meaning and these kinds of things show back up, it's not so much that the scientific accounts have to be completely falsified. I think it's they have to be expanded to include something like that email was revelatory of who was showing up at our campus. Someone that valued a non-reproductive relationship with his favorite human and thought about a graduate student and enjoys tasting wine because some wines are better than others, and that's an aesthetic experience. Like, anyway, that to me is something that, at least, in the UK science religion stuff, I saw more and more students, be it coming out of the sciences or going to the sciences, coming out of philosophy and religious studies, as having there's a genuine energy there. And that to me is exciting. And I think like the questions around AI and such are another occasion where a bad answer of consciousness or a bad answer of storytelling sets us up to not have a framework for addressing real empirical problems that come up, like bioengineering or the way, we listed these big ones, like having a story that has traction with our scientific account, but also traction with the moral formation and shaping of human beings that we celebrate is exciting. That's why I like Whitehead's thing of, it's not just being fit for life. There's life and there's better life. And there's qualities to it, qualities that we desire and qualities that we recognize in wise others and such.
And we didn't even have time to get to the question of whether the AIs will be conscious.
Oh, yeah.
Not impossible.
Okay.
Impossible.
One last question. And this is, I thought of it because I just got back from 3 weeks in the middle of nowhere. And so only the
Sounds
books,
fun.
only the books. Well, it was with 3 children and I had to give lectures, but it was in, Montana and Wyoming and stuff. But I took all your books on my iPad and was thinking about this. And you've kind of brought it up a number of times on the podcast, but in Why Buddhism is True, in The Moral Animal, you're very attentive to our language as a species emerges out of all these biological drives and everything that's sitting there, and these cognitive mechanisms emerge and such. How does that change the way you think about those drives in relationship to AI, and those drives in relationship to AI maybe even differently, right? When it's a large language model that's picking up, obviously those things are sitting there in some sense in the language it's picking up. Those drives in a large language model seems a bit different than, say, artificial intelligence that's embodied AI, where the artificial intelligence is engaging the world materially in some way. And that distinction in the series of interviews has showed up a number of times with computer scientists or people that are working on AI research about like the what are the evolutionary inheritances that show up in large language models because we have them in the language, and then how does that differ from the kind of development when the training includes, say, this individual embodied AI actually engaging the world?
Yeah, well, this is a huge question. I mean, what motivations will a given AI have? And I mean, the question that comes up most often in the context of these kind of sci-fi doomer scenarios, where the AI, the superintelligence, gets out of control and decides to kill us all or whatever. And I don't totally dismiss the sci-fi scenarios. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around them. But a big question is, well, wait, but why would AI want power? Why would AI, and so on? And then it won't naturally be power seeking in the way humans are by virtue of their evolutionary history. On the other hand, as you suggested, it's possible that some degree of motivation can sneak in through the language that it's training on, since it's human language. And then the other answer is that, well, it won't seek power per se, but if it's really smart and you give it a complicated goal, like maximize profit for this company, it'll realize that it can do the best job of maximizing profit if it has various kinds of power it can exercise. And so it will pursue power. But, I would just say that is kind of the $64,000 question. What motivations will AIs have? To what extent can we guide that and fine tune that? It's another reason that if it's true that a super intelligent AI would have the ability to, dominate us, then yeah, you would like to shape AIs collectively with other human beings around the planet, because in that scenario, a single one being built in any country could wind up being trouble for everybody. Now, that's an extreme scenario, but it does illustrate the fact that the consequences of AI will cross borders for good and for bad. But you've hit on a very big question. So we're
Well, you'll have it all figured out when the book comes out.
I guarantee it. It's any moment now, inspiration will strike. Yes, and insight.
All right. Well, do you have an idea about when it will come out?
It's supposed to come out just about a year from now, but I'm gonna have to hurry.
All righty.
Like August of 2025 is the thinking.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
So, yeah.
Well, I'll be looking forward to it, Bob. And
well, thank you for letting me talk about it, Tripp. I appreciate
Nonzero
it.
Newsletter. Everyone can go check it out. nonzero.substack.com. And all the cool kids discover that if they become a member, then they get the extended edition of all the podcasts. And they've already heard your conversation with Nick on AI, and then they can become a Bobist.
That's the next step. It's a big step. I don't counsel taking it without very careful consideration. But I know I'm one, and it's been a very fulfilling life. And right now I'm the only one, but it's been a very, very fulfilling life as a Bobist.
Right.